Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Hawk Blogger. And today is a special day. Today is a special day because, as we talked about yesterday, we get to talk to Robert Mays on a weekly basis. And this is the first of those episodes brought to you all by Pagliacci Pizza. And you want to make sure you head over to your nearest Pagliacci Pizza this Saturday because it's Free Slice Day, celebrating 45 years in business. As Pat, their owner, said yesterday, the Kenny Easley anniversary for the business. So head on over to Pagliacci Pizza and get a slice. And why not get a pie ahead of time? You got all week. There's football coming, so do it now. Robert, man, it's good to have you back. We had you during the draft, had a great conversation. Everyone loved that. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. I came out of this weekend just very excited to watch some football. I'm pumped for Thursday. I'm glad there's a game on Friday. My brother's going to come down. We're going to watch it together. I'm always ready for this week by the time it gets here. Even last week, I think everyone in the NFL world was kind of in this place where it was, let's just get to the games. Let's just get there. It is time. Let's finally kick this stuff off. So I'm very happy that we're almost there.
It's so true. I mean, there's that I think you reach the depths of the off season when there's the rankings. Everyone's ranking every position group and everything. And you're just like, oh my God, can we get to actually to the point where we just are talking about what happened instead of what might happen if we are not computers. We cannot do 1,000 simulations or 10,000 simulations effectively. We can't even do one. But it is fun to talk about, and then it ceases to be a little bit. So this week's big. I got to ask you because not everybody knows your background, and you wrote at Grantland. You've obviously you've been at the Ringer, at the Athletic now. For my money, the best football podcast out there, and I'm not just saying that because you're here. I listen to it all the time, and I got to ask you. You did something that kind of annoyed me. I got to be honest, just to be clear. You did this interview with Sean McVay, and I left that interview kind of liking Sean McVay, and I blame you for that. So I just want to say that. But honestly, talk about he was a little fanboying with you. Like, he listens to your show. He like admires and respects the work you do. He's one of the smartest coaches in the NFL. Putting modesty aside, like, how does that happen? Like, how do you feel like you've been able to build a brand and a reputation where you've got NFL coaches that want to sit down with you in their homes and talk football?
I have no idea. I truly have no idea. And with Sean, it was really fun. He reached out to me a couple of years ago, just randomly, that he had kind of stumbled onto the show, and I don't know why he started listening to it. And that note meant a lot in the moment. And then he and I talked several times over the last couple of years, and I think a lot of the conversations that we had privately, just about football and other things, that's what I wanted to communicate in that discussion. And I think that he was very generous with how much he was willing to share and the time he gave us. And if he wasn't, then none of that would have mattered. But for the most part, I just try to walk into these conversations with questions that I actually want to know the answers to. Mm-hmm. That truly is as simple as the approach gets. And that can be with coaches, that can be with players. I think a lot of these guys, just by the nature of the business, they get asked the same things often. They get asked about things that are going to drive interest with, local headlines and just the state of the team and expectations and things like that. And I don't really have to worry about that kind of stuff. During my discussions, I can be nerdy and weird and just kind of be like, hey, I have a question about this very specific thing that you do. Can you just explain this to me? And I think putting guys in that position as often as I can, that's really all I'm trying to do. And for the most part, I think that it can be a pretty fruitful way to explore stuff.
Well, there's this concept in like high school, and I want to make sure the context is there, of like a floater who moves between cliques, between the jocks, between the drama kids, the choir kids, whatever. And I've seen you move between the hipster film guys, the geek analytics guys, the hardcore football guys. I'm curious if you feel like any one of those kind of cliques that exist within the NFL is kind of home for you.
I don't at all. And honestly, there are times where that feels a little scary. The fact that I kind of belong to no groups, and I think that I kind of float out there by myself every so often, and it
Mm-hmm.
can feel like you're kind of floating out there without a safety net or a place to belong. But I just try to be authentic to the way I want to talk about it. I mean, that's really it. There's no grander plan. There's no strategy behind any of this. It's just trying to be authentic and curious in the ways that I want to be about the sport. And that's really the only guiding light that exists.
Well, just so happens, I really appreciate you, in honor of this Pagliacci sponsorship, dropping your NFC West preview on the same day that we have this first episode. But by the way, for folks that are just tuning in, this will be something that we do every Monday. So it's special that it's Tuesday this week, but we will be the day after most games getting together with Robert to talk about the weekend that was. Obviously, I immediately listened to at least the Seahawks portion of that preview. And one of the many reasons I was excited to have you as a guest through regularly along the way is you're a Geno guy. I don't have to convince you about Geno. I don't have to worry about that. In fact, I think the two of us are going to have to help each other monitor our expectations there. But it was interesting listening to you kind of go through this team and share your perspectives about where there's some strengths. One of the things that stood out is when you guys were talking about any like blue chip players on this team, and the initial thought was maybe none. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I don't know how many superstars there are on this roster right now. I think there are ascending players that you can get really excited about. I just think this roster has a ton of players on like the line down from that. I think Geno belongs on that line. Obviously, DK Metcalf is a really good player. We'll see what happens with some of the young offensive linemen. I think the last year was obviously pretty disappointing, but Charles Cross didn't suddenly become not a promising guy. I think that there were just some injury concerns last year and just the state of that unit overall. Like Kenneth Walker has promise. And then you go to the defensive side of the ball. And it's like Tariq Woolen reminds me of the Charles Cross thing. It's like Tariq Woolen still has something to him. Can he look better in better circumstances? I think Devin Weatherspoon, by the time we get to the end of this season, is going to be a superstar. I'm very excited about Byron Murphy, but there just aren't that many guys who've already ascended to that place. But just to be very clear, I'm very intrigued by a lot of the players they have on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, and to be transparent here, I mean, the Seahawks haven't had an all-pro player that was young and ascending. They've had a Bobby Wagner style all-pro player, but that's a little bit different. They've had a Michael Dixon punter all-pro player, that kind of thing. But that's not what we're looking for. And that is a conversation. This team has been mired in kind of the messy middle of the NFL for a little while. And the thing that separates the middle from the top are those all-pro, best at their position, best 1 to 3 at their position kind of guys. The Seahawks just have had a lot of good players. And so one of the things you brought up there is a kind of a measure of success for this season is, can Mike Macdonald and Ryan Grubb prove that they can be talent optimizers and get the most out of them? What's your current take on that?
I'm excited about that because I think the last 2 times that we saw these guys, they were talent optimizers. The Ryan Grubb thing is a little bit complicated and naughty because there's a chance he just had a lot of talent and they looked really good in that situation. But I think the construction of that offense leads me to believe that one of the reasons a lot of the guys on that Washington offense look so good is because they were consistently being put in good positions. On the defensive side of the ball, just think about what the Ravens were last year. I mean, Jadeveon Clowney's been in the league for a decade, and he had his best season as a pass rusher at age like 32 last year. I think that has a lot to do with what Mike Macdonald does on that side. And you had so many guys that were just stopgap players within that defense that played really good football. Cal Van Noy got there 4 weeks into the season, and he had one of his best years as a pass rusher. Arthur Millette, there were guys in the Steelers organization that were like mocking the Ravens for signing him, and he was a perfectly functional slot corner last year. Ronald Darby, same sort of deal. Like, no matter who walks into that building, if you're an end of the roster guy, you suddenly become a capable rotation player. If you're a capable rotation player, you suddenly become a plus starter. If you're a plus starter, you suddenly become a superstar. And that's exactly what you want from a coach who's the architect on that side of the ball.
Yeah, the common narrative, at least that I hear nationally, is, yep, Mike Macdonald's great. might take him some time. Look at what happened in Baltimore. It took him a little while. It took till Roquan Smith got there. One of the interesting things there, Robert, is I look back and the first 8 games of that season for the Ravens, they were actually 21st in EPA allowed, EPA per play. Now, the reason I bring that up is I think the Seahawks would take 21st in EPA per play compared to what they've rolled out there the last couple of years. And I question whether this Seahawks defense is in the same state, talent-wise, progression-wise, assembly-wise, that Ravens defense was for those first 8 games. What's kind of your take on how quickly you expect this to kind of take shape?
The reason I think this is different is because that was year 1 of Mike Macdonald being a defensive coordinator in the NFL, period. And I think beyond his personnel and the ways that he wanted to play on defense in Baltimore, he had to figure out how he wanted to coach defense in the NFL. And I think he's so much further along in that regard, specifically from a mindset perspective, just organizationally. Like, how do I want to think about down and distance? How do I want to think about certain personnel groupings? So on that side, I think it has a chance to click a little bit faster just because he's further along in his progression and understanding who he wants to be as a defensive play caller. From a personnel perspective, it's always going to take time, especially when you look at the way that they're constructed. You know, they have those situations where it's okay, you know, do we want to play a little bit more 3 safety stuff because we don't have the linebackers we had in Baltimore? What is the defensive front rotation going to look like? Who's our best 4 when it's 3rd and 7? I think all of that is going to take some time to figure out just because it's an eclectic group of players and there are a lot of different layers to it. But I think the Macdonald side of this is more solidified than it would have been at the start of the 2022 season.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because people also forget that was kind of his first go around as a DC in the NFL. And he's got a lot more under his feet experience wise than he did at that point and knows a little bit more about what might work and what might not. He's had a little bit more time to learn from that. I should call out for people that don't know. They should pick it up just by looking at you. You are in Chicago. You are a Chicago guy. You are a Bears fan. And one of the other reasons I'm looking forward to this conversation through the year is I will be throwing shade Shane Waldron's way. I just will, and I won't always do it intentionally, but part of the reasons I'll be excited about Ryan Grubb is a juxtaposition to some of the things that we saw from Shane Waldron. You and I have kind of chatted about this, so this is not new information to you. And Shane Waldron's there with the Bears and Caleb Williams. So I'm going to take a quick detour and just like check in with you. How are you feeling about your Bears? Like, this is the team of the NFL this year that I think everybody's maybe most excited to see.
I'm looking forward to the floor that I think Shane Waldron establishes as an offensive coordinator. I am concerned about the ceiling. I guess that's how I would frame the conversation. Yeah. You look at the Seahawks and what they were over the last 2 years offensively. They were like a borderline top 10 offense. You could argue that maybe they should have been better than that for some stretches, but there was certainly a floor to the way that they played on offense. I'm just concerned about, you know, some of the ticks that he has, like some of the personnel grouping decisions and the fact that they're going to be like this 12 personnel team potentially, even though they have Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, and DJ Moore, and just some of the things when he was constructing the offense in Seattle where it was harder than it needed to be sometimes. And the high degree of difficulty throws that we saw from Geno a little bit way too often, is that going to be a similar concern when we're talking about Caleb Williams in Chicago? So it's mixed feelings. Like the guy has been the play caller for a borderline top 10 offense for each of the last 2 years. If the Bears finish 14th in offensive DVOA this year, we're going to have a party in Chicago. Like, there's going to be a parade down Michigan Avenue. So I think that it's hard not to be excited just because the players they have, but I also understand some of the reservations based on how things went in Seattle the last couple of years.
Yeah. And I think you should know this, that we've got a pool among my crew here about whether it's going to be more likely that Shane Waldron gets a head coaching job next or whether he gets fired next. And there's pretty even split about who thinks Caleb Williams is going to help elevate him to a head coaching job he doesn't deserve, and others that think that he is going to be blamed for Caleb Williams not being quite the player that everyone hopes that he will be. So that'll be a fun thing to kind of check in along the way. But segueing into kind of the high difficulty throws, you talked about Geno Smith having to make last year. How much do you think that is the scheme and the play calls? How much do you think that is Geno Smith's propensity to pick the hardest thing on the field to go after because he feels ultra confident that he can fit it into a tight window?
It's probably a little column A, a little column B. And that's
Mm-hmm.
why I like Geno so much, is that you have to rein him in versus pushing him forward. And I think that's exactly the type of quarterback I tend to fall in love with. But I also think if you look at the construction of the roster, or the construction of the offense, literally from a geometry perspective, it was the widest offense in the NFL. Like, those guys lived outside of the numbers. And talking to Shane Waldron about that when I was in Chicago like 2 weeks ago, I mean, his view on that is that it's an expression of the talent that they had. DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are vertical outside the numbers sort of players. I would quibble with that a little bit just because JSN is the opposite of that. And I think that they kind of failed to properly fold him into what they were doing. And that's why I'm excited about this version of the offense potentially, because you still have those vertical outside the numbers players in a vertical passing offense. But if you watch what Washington was last year, they had so many answers for easy throws, especially like against man coverage on third down, the amount of stacks, the amount of bunches, the amount of motion. So what I'm looking forward to potentially is an offense that gets the best of both worlds, where you're allowed to tap into the aggressiveness of who Geno is and of the players that you have, while also providing enough easy answers, especially on late downs, to be able to just make things a little bit easier overall on your quarterback and the rest of the players on your offense.
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces there that I personally am really interested in. So, preseason's, whatever that quality of football is hard to say, but I saw a number come out that the Seahawks were using motion 70% of snaps, which was second only to the Dolphins in terms of the amount of times that was happening. That combined with a player that I think most people nationally are not even aware is on the Seahawks, Laviska Shenault, has a chance to actually be a sleeper. He's not going to be a top player. He's not going to be someone you need on your fantasy team, but a guy that's going to carry the ball effectively, who's going to block effectively, and be a little bit of an easy yards after catch. Like, this is a guy that led the NFL in yards after catch per reception just a couple years back. That seems to align with your perspective here of Grubb potentially giving Geno some easier throws to kind of not always have to take the hardest one.
For me, it's you go watch Seattle or you go watch Washington last year. And obviously the hashes are different, so they can play a little bit wide. Watching that offense was kind of strange. It was very college-y, where you have these stacks and bunches like you're the Rams, but they're took 20 yards outside of the tackle. But you still, the idea is, all right, I'm just creating a little bit of traffic for defenders if it's 3rd and 7, and I think I'm going to get man coverage. And the routes that I'm thinking of are just the way that some of those choice routes would distribute in those moments. So you have a choice route runner, most likely JSN, in some of these situations where I can get him isolated on an interior defender, whether it's a nickel, a safety, whoever, and I can allow him to kind of that short area quickness to take over. That's what I want to see. Like, I just want to see some answers in those moments, because it just felt like last year they didn't have enough of them. If you look at the numbers, this team was horrendous on third down against man coverage last year. Like, that's one of the worst things that they did. And so I just think some of those option routes and just some of those designs and man beating concepts in those moments, those are the easy throws that I'm looking forward to that I just didn't think existed in this offense last year.
So as two verified Geno backers, let's flip the bit for a second. What does Geno have to prove to actually earn the respect that is still not there for him nationally and even locally to some extent? People still see him as just a guy, just see him as an average or even like a backup level quarterback. What does he have to do to kind of take that next step?
I think it would probably just be the easier stuff that we're talking about, because the splash throws are there. If you want to find the splash throws, there are as many of them as almost any quarterback in the NFL. But I think just consistently finding efficiency within the offense and just making things look a little bit less frustrating. I think that's the problem. Even if you're somebody who's optimistic about what the Seahawks are, is watching them over the last couple of years offensively, there was a lot of frustration in how stop and start it could feel at times. So I think stepping outside of that, combining a little bit more down-to-down efficiency with those high-level, oh my God, sort of throws that Geno consistently makes. I mean, that's in the end, I think that would make him somebody that everyone in the league, everyone who watches the NFL would have to pay a little bit more attention to.
Let's flip sides, or not sides of the ball, but let's flip sides to the opponent this week, the Broncos, because I also listened to some of your perspectives on the AFC West and what's going on there. If I asked you for odds after Vance Joseph's defense had given up 70 points and 1,000,000 yards to the Dolphins, and then made your guy Justin Fields look like Tom Brady in consecutive weeks. If I asked you for odds that Vance Joseph would still be the defensive coordinator at the end of the season, let alone the next year, what would you have said?
Probably pretty low, but I understand why it happened, because this was an interesting situation where Vance Joseph comes in as the defensive coordinator when they had maintained a lot of the Broncos defensive staff from the prior year. So he's learning a lot of the ideas that they were trying to use under Ejiro Evero because their defense was so good.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's calling a defense that isn't really his to a certain extent. And so I think that there was always going to be an acclimation period with that setup with their defensive staff. And if you look at what they were essentially after week 4 last year, they were an average defense. They weren't good, but they weren't horrendous. So I think there's probably a little bit of Sean Payton understanding how hard of a job Vance Joseph was trying to do as he got used to some ideas that maybe aren't really built into his DNA, and giving him a little bit of grace because of that. And they came out essentially like in the middle of the pack where they probably wanted to be from the beginning.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's fascinating about Vance Joseph. He's been a blitz heavy guy. I think he was 4th or 5th in the NFL in blitz rate last year, like 35%. But generally, I want you to check me on this, Robert. Generally, like blitz happy teams have to have some sort of coverage ability on the back end to cover, because blitzes aren't always going to get home, and you tend to give up a lot of explosive plays, which is what they did last year. They gave up, I think they were 26th in the NFL in explosive run plays allowed, 26th in explosive pass plays allowed. You got Patrick Surtain, but then you've got, who do you got? I mean, is Riley Moss really a guy that can handle all the attention he's going to get? Are those safeties? Brendan Jones, who they got from the Dolphins, you talk to Dolphins people, they're like, good for him that he got that contract. I don't know how he got that contract, but he did. What's the case to be made there that this defense can take a real step forward?
It's probably the front being a little bit healthier and a little bit more complete than it was last year. And I think if you look at teams that are giving up a lot of explosive plays, a lot of that is communication as much as it's defensive personnel talent on that side of the ball. And I think that was the Broncos' biggest problem early in that season, is just that defense wasn't on the same page again, because I think that they were just getting used to the way that they wanted to play. But if the case for them taking a step forward this year is that I just think that their front is more complete. Like, you look at the amount of juice that team has with Jonah Ellis stepping in there now, with Baron Browning being healthy for the full season potentially. They went out and got some bigger bodies. John Franklin Myers is there now. DJ Jones is still there. I think that front has a chance to be a pretty good unit, like one that can be scary when you're in defined passing situations. We move outside of that, and I think there are a few more concerns and a few more questions about what this team is going to look like.
Yeah, and in this particular matchup, it's going to be interesting because I have looked. I mean, Zach Allen had 60 pressures last year. John Franklin Myers is one of the sleeper gets. I think that was a really good move by the Broncos. He's a quality, like, underrated lineman. Baron Browning is one of the still best kept secrets for most NFL, because he's never played more than 400 or 500 snaps in a year. But he's playing in this game, so it doesn't matter if he doesn't play in future games. And he's been really good. Jonathan Cooper, Jonah Ellis, you mentioned it. Nick Bonito, like, all these guys can be effective pass rushers. They struggle in run defense. They've struggled in that regard. And then if you're going to be a blitz team and you're going to be an aggressive pass rush team, if you couple that with a grub offense that's going to look for some of these quick passes and potentially exploit blitzing teams, feels like a tough first matchup for Vance Joseph in that defense in week 1. Am I right there? Do you feel differently?
I think that that's right on a few different levels. One, we don't really know exactly what this is going to look like. Whatever they showed in the preseason, they showed in the preseason. But anytime you're talking about a new system and a new staff that's coming from college to the NFL specifically, there's so many different layers of intrigue that go into this. I think even if you did your homework, if you're Vance Joseph and that staff, there's still a lot of big questions about what the final product is going to be. And I also just think the construction of the offense makes it difficult on defenses. You're talking to guys that had to play against Ryan Grubb last year. It's a lot of the same concerns you have when you're playing against really good NFL offenses. Formationally, they make it difficult on you. All of the motions that they use to undress what you're trying to do. I mean, they were even difficult for a team like Michigan. I know Michigan had played really well against them, but that Michigan defense is born of the type of defense the Seahawks are going to play. And I don't think it's an accident that an offense that gave Jesse Minter some trouble in terms of preparing for it, and the relationship that Jesse Minter and Mike Macdonald have lead to the marriage we now see between Ryan Grubb and Mike Macdonald. So I just think it's a hard offense to play against no matter who you are, and especially when there's that mystery box element coming into week one.
So let's talk about the Broncos offense. I mean, it's an interesting, you got Sean Payton, he gave up a lot to get Sean Payton. He's now got his quarterback that he didn't want is out of there. And Seahawks fans know well about Russell Wilson and his shortcomings and strengths. Although they seem to be, even the strengths seem to be diminished at this point. Now he's got Bo Nix, spent the 12th overall pick. What's your take on what's a realistic expectation for Bo Nix to come in here? And I'll give you two things that kind of stood out to me. This is a guy that had one of the lowest sack rates historically as a college football quarterback, and one of the lower interception rates. He has not turned the ball over historically, and he has not been sacked historically, and he's a runner. Does that set him up for some early, like, greater success than some other rookie quarterbacks in their first game?
I don't know. Success is hard to define there. I think that there's going to be people are going to look at his completion percentage over the course of his rookie season and be like, oh man, wow. Like Bo Nix is completing like 68% of his passes. This is impressive. And then you're going to look at the ADOT and it's going to make more sense. And I think his numbers at Oregon in those two areas specifically, how quick he was getting the ball out and how little he was getting sacked, is a product of what that passing game was built like. And so my biggest question is, how much of that are we going to see incorporated into what the Broncos offense is? And we saw in the preseason, it was a decent amount. I mean, this team was running a ton of RPOs and kind of leaning into what Bo Nix's strengths are, because that's what Bo Nix does well. His short area accuracy is really impressive. So letting him sit back there and play point guard in sort of this dink and dunk RPO based offense feels like the best model for him. I just don't know what the ceiling of that sort of offense looks like, because if you can't create explosive plays, you just have to be so incredibly efficient to get by. And with a rookie quarterback putting a lot of that on him early on, I think that there are some dangers that potentially come with that.
Yeah, the Seahawks and Broncos have some history, as you know, including a Super Bowl that involved a Seahawks defense that basically just sat on all the underneath and intermediate routes and didn't believe that Peyton Manning was going to be able to throw over them. And that worked out pretty well in that game. I look, very different teams, very different times, but I look at this Broncos offense and you got Courtland Sutton as your number one. He feels like at best like a solid 2. I look at Josh Reynolds and Marvin Mims Jr. and I'm like, if you're going to be a quick passing team, you need guys that are quick to uncover. I don't know that either Josh Reynolds or Marvin Mims. Marvin Mims is a deep threat. Like, what does he do? They got rid of Tim Patrick, which seems like a guy that would be a quick to uncover player, potentially. So it feels like a little bit of a mismatch between maybe this style of Bo Nix and the receivers that they got. Or do you see it differently?
I don't see it that differently. I honestly think I'm more excited about what this offense looks like with Marvin Mims instead of Tim Patrick. Because if it was Tim Patrick, I would just be worried about the lack of speed you have whatsoever. At least with a guy like Marvin Mims, you hope that you can clear out some space because you have somebody who's consistently lifting the coverage. So that, I think, just allows Courtland Sutton, Josh Reynolds, whoever your underneath receivers are, to operate with a little bit more room. And so everything else, if they hadn't done that, I just think would feel so condensed and compressed that the Marvin Mims element of this, I actually think, is a positive potentially for the Broncos and not a negative.
All right. And the last thing I'll ask you, what's your game other than the Bears game, other than the Seahawks game? What's the game this week that you're most looking forward to seeing?
You're going to find this out about me, is that I have no idea what the games are before I start actually prepping for the week. So I don't even know who's playing in week 1. This is not an exaggeration.
Is there a team that
I'm
you're
looking at
most
the
looking
schedule
forward
right
to
now.
seeing?
I'm looking at the schedule right now. I'm ready to roll. I'm very excited about Rams Lions. I was at that game last year in the playoffs. The play style of both of those teams, what the offenses could look like. I cannot wait to watch that on Sunday night. And I'm really excited for Texans Colts. I'm just looking forward to what the Anthony Richardson offense potentially is. And I'm really excited to watch the Texans play football this week. So those are probably the 2 games I would point to. But yeah, you'll learn this about me. If you ask me the schedule for the following week on Monday, that you're going to get a lot of blank stares.
Good to know. We will learn that and adjust along the way. Robert, I got to do quick thank yous before I let you go. Corey Hickok has gifted 5 memberships. Appreciate you, Corey. Thank you for doing it. Rebecca Braun has become a member. Welcome, Rebecca. And then, my goodness, we've got more here coming up. I gotta scroll through. So many people are excited. Detail Oriented has gifted 50 memberships. Detail, thank you so much for all that you've done, and hopefully you're healing up and feeling better. Isaac, thank you for gifting memberships, as well as Italian Night. So thank you for everybody for all your generosity. I think everyone's very excited, Robert, to have you aboard and to continue this conversation. So thank you. And thanks to Pagliacci Pizza for sponsoring this each week. We will see you next Monday after we actually have some real games to talk about. Thanks, Robert.
Looking forward to it. See ya.
All right, everybody. That is another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Hawk Blogger. Make sure you follow Robert at Robert Mays. And take care. We will see you soon.